built this company," he said, sliding the papers across the table. "You just lived in the house it paid for." Miriam Calloway did not answer. She looked at the papers for a long moment, then looked at her husband of 17 years, and understood that the man she had believed she was fighting to save had already left a very long time ago. She picked up the pen, she signed. What Douglas Hale did not know, what nobody in their corner of Charleston, South Carolina knew, was that 14 months later Miriam would walk into a room that would turn his certainty to ash, that the woman he had called decorative, peripheral, quietly unnecessary, would be standing at a podium in front of 200 people who had spent years waiting to meet her, that the ground he thought he owned was hers and always had been. But that comes later. Miriam had grown up in Somerville, 30 minutes outside Charleston, in a house that smelled like lemon oil and old wood. Her mother, June Calloway, was a seamstress who took in alterations from the women in town and charged less than she should have and never complained about it. She wore her hair pinned up every morning, and she was never idle. June had quiet hands and a precise mind, and she believed deeply and without apology that a person's worth was not something you displayed. It was something you carried. She died when Miriam was 31. She left behind her sewing table, a savings account with $11,000 in it, a small storage unit outside Somerville that Miriam did not even know existed, and a sealed letter in an envelope marked "when you need it most." Miriam had tucked the letter into her coat pocket at the funeral and brought it home. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table, under her reading glasses, and a book she kept meaning to finish. Life moved. The drawer stayed closed. She had met Douglas Hale 6 months after her mother died, when the grief was still heavy and the world still felt slightly tilted. He was confident in the way that certain men are confident, loudly, completely, as if the room had been waiting for them. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm out of downtown Charleston. He made decisions quickly and talked about himself fluently and laughed at exactly the right moments. She had found that steadiness comforting in those early months when she had no steadiness of her own. They married 18 months later. She was 33. For the first several years, it was fine. Fine is a word that covers a great deal. It covers dinners that are pleasant enough and silences that are not yet heavy, and the quiet accommodation of two people learning to share a life. But fine is not the same as good, and Miriam had known the difference and told herself it didn't matter. It started mattering around year 9. Douglas began staying late at the office. Not occasionally, consistently. He stopped asking about her day. Not gradually, completely. He would sit across from her at dinner and look slightly past her, as if she were a painting he had stopped noticing. When she spoke about her work, she ran the communications department for a regional nonprofit focused on rural education. He would nod with the specific patience of a man who was not listening and had no intention of starting. She told herself she was imagining it. Then she stopped telling herself that. The woman's name was Tatum Rourke, 27 years old, a leasing agent in Douglas's firm, glossy and assured, who had never been asked to make herself smaller to fit anyone else's space, because she had never had to. Miriam found out the way most women find out, not from a single dramatic revelation, but from an accumulation of small wrong details that eventually became impossible to explain away. A text left open on the counter, a scent that was not hers, the particular quality of distance that only develops when someone's attention is entirely elsewhere. She did not confront him immediately. She sat with it for 3 weeks, the way you sit with a diagnosis, trying to find the version of reality where it means something different. There was no other version. When she told him she knew, Douglas did not apologize. He said he had been unhappy for years. He said she had never really understood what he was building. He said, and this was the sentence she would turn over in her mind many times in the months that followed, "You've been comfortable, Miri. Comfortable is fine for some people. I need someone who actually shows up." She looked at him across the kitchen of the house she had organized and maintained, and filled with the quiet daily effort of 17 years, and she felt something close inside her. Not break. Close. The way a door closes when it has finally found the right frame. She signed the papers 6 weeks later. The morning after the divorce was finalized, she opened the drawer and took out her mother's letter. "Miriam," it began, If you are reading this now, something has cracked open. That is not always a terrible thing. I want to tell you something I should have said while I was still there to see your face. You remember the storage unit in Somerville, the one your father paid into for 30 years before he passed? I never told you what was in it because the time wasn't right. Barnwell and Associates in downtown Charleston manages it. Ask for Mr. Arthur Barnwell. He knew your father. He has been waiting for your call. I love you more than you know. I always did. Go call him. Her father, Thomas Calloway, had died when Miriam was 11. She remembered him as a tall man with careful eyes who worked in logistics, who read everything, who could be in a room with you and make you feel completely accompanied without saying a word. She remembered his hands. She did not remember much else. Grief at 11 is a strange, incomplete thing. She called Mr. Arthur Barnwell that same morning. Arthur Barnwell was 74 years old, semi-retired with a voice like unhurried water. He did not ask her to come to him. He came to her. He arrived 2 hours later in a gray suit, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had been with him a very long time, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he told her everything. Thomas Calloway had not been only a logistics man. 38 years ago, while working freight contracts across the Southeast, he had begun quietly buying parcels of farmland. Distressed properties, undervalued acreage in counties that no one was looking at yet. He had a gift for seeing what a piece of land would be worth in 20 years, not what it was worth now. He bought steadily, patiently. He held, he reinvested. He formed a small LLC called Calloway Land Holdings and kept it entirely private. He used the income from leases and occasional sales to fund rural school programs across 3 states. No announcement, no naming rights, no plaques. Just the funding, delivered quietly, year after year. When he died, everything transferred into a trust managed by Arthur Barnwell to be administered for Miriam when the time came. Her mother had known. Her mother had said nothing because Thomas had believed, firmly, almost stubbornly, that Miriam needed to find out who she was on her own terms first. That money handed to someone before they had learned to stand on their own could be more damage than gift. How much? Miriam asked. Arthur Barnwell folded his hands on the table. The land portfolio, current valuation, liquid assets, and trust holdings. He paused in the way of a man who has delivered significant news before and understands that silence is part of it. Conservatively, $2.4 billion. The kitchen was very quiet. Miriam looked at her hands, the hands that had drafted grant proposals and attended school board meetings and cooked Douglas's dinners and been called comfortable by a man who had no idea who she was. And she felt something move through her that was not shock, exactly. It was more like recognition, like a word she had been reaching for a long time and had finally just found. She did not tell anyone. Not her sister Diane, who was warm and wonderful and would have told her husband before the call was over. Not her friend Greta, who loved her without condition but processed joy loudly, and Miriam needed quiet. Not her son Eli, 23, in his last year of graduate school in Boston, who had his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's hands, and his mother's exactness, and who would be told but not yet. She retained a private legal team in Columbia. 4 people with no connection to Douglas or his firm. She spent 3 weeks in careful meetings understanding the full scope of Calloway Land Holdings. The parcels, the leases, the trust structure, the rural programs her father had quietly maintained for nearly 4 decades. Then she went to find herself again. She moved into a small house on Sullivan's Island, 20 minutes from Charleston, with a wide front porch and salt air, and a fig tree in the back garden that had clearly been doing exactly as it pleased for many years. She planted things. She started running again, something she had abandoned somewhere around year 7 of her marriage, when her schedule had slowly reorganized itself around Douglas's preferences. She called Eli on Tuesday evenings. She slept without an alarm. She was 3 months into this when she met Corbin Marsh. Corbin was 46, a landscape architect who had spent 15 years working on public parks and community green spaces in cities that had been told they didn't have the budget for beauty. He designed pocket parks in neighborhoods that had never had one. He put benches in places where old men could sit. He planted trees on streets that hadn't had shade in 30 years. He was not flashy about it. He was methodical and somewhat serious, and he had a dry, unhurried sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments and was funnier for how rarely it announced itself. He came to Sullivan's Island because of the fig tree. Calloway Land Holdings had funded a community garden initiative through a horticultural nonprofit in Charleston, and Corbin was the project lead on 3 of the sites. He needed to consult with someone on the trust side about a site off Middle Street. The meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes. He arrived to find Miriam on her front porch in a linen shirt, having what appeared to be a vigorous, silent disagreement with the fig tree, which had once again sent a branch aggressively into the space where she wanted to put a chair. He stood at the gate. "It's been there longer than you have," he said. She turned. She looked at him directly. "That's not the point." "What's the point?" "The point is that there's a principle involved." He looked at the tree. He looked at her. "The tree seems unconcerned with the principle." "Most things I care about are," she said. He smiled, the quiet kind that does more work than a loud one. "Corbin Marsh," he said. "Miriam Calloway," she said. They shook hands. He came back twice a week for the project meetings. She had been operating in an advisory capacity on the Trust's community programs, and they ended up working through 3 sites together over 6 weeks. She had strong opinions about access, who could actually use a space, not just who it was designed for. He disagreed with her twice in the first week, and both times they argued the point until it became something better than either version they had started with. She found this satisfying in a way she had not expected. He began staying past the meetings. They would sit on the porch after, talking about the projects, then about other things. He brought coffee the 3rd time without asking if she wanted it, because he had noticed she had a mug in her hand within 15 minutes of every meeting starting and had drawn a reasonable conclusion. One evening in late October, she mentioned that she had not been to a proper restaurant since the divorce, that every time she considered it, the idea of sitting alone with a menu felt like a statement she wasn't ready to make. He was quiet for a moment. "You wouldn't be alone," he said. She looked at him. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not a working dinner. One where we don't discuss square footage or soil composition." "What would we discuss?" He thought about it. "You," he said. "I'd like to know more about you, Miriam. Not the trust, not the projects. You." She looked at him in the fading late afternoon light and felt something she had trained herself not to feel. The specific warmth of being genuinely interesting to someone. Not useful, interesting. "Saturday," she said. 7 o'clock. He nodded once and left. She stood on the porch after his car disappeared down the street and pressed her hand flat to her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat doing something uncomplicated and honest. Saturday came. He arrived in a jacket the color of good charcoal, and he brought her a small potted rosemary plant. Not flowers. He had noticed, he explained simply, that she had an herb garden starting along the south wall, and it didn't have rosemary yet. She stood at the door, holding the pot, and felt something move in her chest like a clock finding its rhythm. They went to a small restaurant on the peninsula. Corner table, good wine, soft lighting. They talked for 3.5 hours. The kind of conversations that doesn't feel like effort because the person across from you makes every subject feel worth arriving at. He asked questions and waited for full answers. He did not interrupt. He told her about his parents' house in Asheville, about the park he'd designed in his 20s that had just been named a landmark, about the fact that he could not for the life of him parallel park. She laughed, genuinely, with no management of it. He walked her to her door. They stood on the porch in the October night, the marsh smell on the air, the stars doing their quiet work above them. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand resting at her cheek for a moment, warm in the cool evening. He did not rush it. "Miriam," he said. Just that. Just her name, without anything attached to it. No request, no condition, no version of her required to answer. She looked at him. She did not look away. He kissed her slowly. The kind of kiss that has nowhere else to be and does not pretend otherwise. The kind that makes you understand, in retrospect, everything you had been settling for. When he pulled back, she kept her eyes closed for one more second. Then, she opened them. He was looking at her the way people look at something they have chosen deliberately. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Corbin." She went inside. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the dark front hallway and listened to her own heartbeat, introducing her to something she had nearly persuaded herself no longer existed. Months passed. Quietly, in the background, something was being prepared. Arthur Barnwell had been patient, but the time had come for Calloway Land Holdings to step fully into the light. Thomas had operated in privacy by choice, not necessity, and his daughter had spent long enough doing the same. The trust's 30-year anniversary was approaching. The land holdings had expanded, the community programs had grown, and there were partnerships now, civic, commercial, philanthropic, that needed the person behind the trust to be visible, accountable, present. Your father was invisible because he chose to be, Arthur said to her one afternoon in November, sitting in her front room, with his tea going cold as it always did. You have the same right, but you also have the right to be seen, Miriam. He would want that for you, not the money, not the power, just being seen. Miriam set down her cup. All right, she said, let's tell it properly. 300 invitations went out, a formal announcement gala, hosted by Calloway Land Holdings Trust at the Palmetto Club in downtown Charleston. Landowners, developers, civic leaders, educators, nonprofit directors, anyone whose work touched the trust's programs across the Southeast. Many of them had been receiving trust funding or working alongside its initiatives for years without ever knowing who owned it. They had corresponded with attorneys and administrators and had never heard the name Miriam Calloway. Douglas Hale's firm received an invitation. Commercial real estate in Charleston and Calloway Land Holdings had adjacent interests. There were parcels, leases, future development opportunities. Douglas accepted without a second look. He came expecting a useful evening. He brought Tatum Rourke, who wore a dress that announced itself and held his arm with the ease of someone who had gotten everything she'd wanted out of this particular arrangement so far. Miriam saw his name on the RSVP list. She put the list down. She went to find a dress. The gala was held on a Friday in December. The Palmetto Club gleaming with candlelight and the particular formality of a room full of people who understood that something significant was about to happen, without yet knowing what. Douglas arrived in a dark suit. He found a good table near the front. Tatum fixed his cufflink. He felt, as he usually did in rooms like this, entirely at ease. Arthur Barnwell stepped to the podium, and the room settled. "Good evening," he said, in the unhurried voice of a man who has been keeping a good secret for a very long time and is finally allowed to tell it. "Before we get to the business of tonight, I want to tell you about a man most of you never met." Douglas refreshed his drink. Thomas Calloway grew up in Summerville, South Carolina. He worked in logistics. He drove a reliable car. He read everything he could get his hands on. He never put his name on anything he built if he could avoid it. Over the course of 38 years, working quietly and with extraordinary patience, Thomas assembled one of the most significant private land trusts in the southeastern United States. He used it every year, without exception, without credit, to fund rural school programs, community libraries, literacy initiatives, and civic infrastructure in counties that had stopped appearing on anyone else's priority list. The room was very still. "He was one of the finest people I have ever been permitted to know," Arthur said. "Thomas passed away 22 years ago. Everything he built transferred, in full, to his daughter. She is the active director of Calloway Land Holdings. She is in this room tonight." A current moved through the crowd. Douglas set his glass down. "She has been running the trust's programs for over a year now, expanding its reach, honoring her father's vision, and doing it because she was raised this way, without any interest in recognition, until tonight." Arthur looked toward the back of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great privilege to introduce to you the owner and director of Calloway Land Holdings Trust. Please welcome Miss Miriam Calloway." The doors at the back of the room opened. She walked in. The applause began before the room had entirely processed what it was seeing, that instinctive response to someone who fills a space in a way that is not performance, not effort, but simply presence, the way a room responds to a window being opened. She wore deep emerald green, a gown structured at the shoulder, clean in its line, moving quietly as she walked. Her hair was up. She wore her mother's earrings, small pearl drops that June Calloway had worn to every important occasion for 30 years. She walked across the Palmetto Club's marble floor like she had always known exactly which room she was walking toward. She had. She just hadn't known the timeline. 300 people rose to their feet. Douglas Hale did not. He sat with the color entirely gone from his face, looking at the woman he had called comfortable. The woman he had told showed up for nothing. Walking across a marble floor in front of 300 people who were on their feet for her, because the ground beneath this entire evening, the trust, the programs, the reason half the people in this room had built what they had built, was hers and always had been. Tatum leaned toward him. Douglas, who is that? He did not answer. Miriam spoke from the front of the room with the confidence of someone who has finally stopped explaining herself and started simply existing. She spoke about her father's vision, about what the trust had funded and what it intended to do next, about the value of quiet, patient, unglamorous work. She did not perform. She did not embellish. Every word landed because it was simply exactly true. When she finished, 300 people gave her a standing ovation that lasted longer than it needed to, because no one wanted to be the first to stop. Afterward, when the room had shifted into the easier movement of cocktail hour, Douglas crossed toward her. He moved quickly, leaving Tatum at the table without a word, weaving through the crowd with the focus of a man who has suddenly understood something he cannot ununderstand. Miriam. She turned. His face was completely undone. The composed, certain, slightly impatient face she had known for 17 years was gone. In its place was something she had never seen on him. The unguarded expression of a man who has just watched every assumption he ever made about another person collapse at once. I don't, he started. He stopped. How long? How long has this been yours? She looked at him calmly, not coldly. She had decided some months ago not to carry him in that particular way. But clearly, it was always there, Douglas, she said. My father built it before I was born. It transferred to me after he died. The trust has been running in the background my entire adult life. He shook his head. You never said anything. You never asked an accusation as a simple, accurate fact. He looked at her for a long moment. The room moved around them unaware. I made a mistake. His voice was low, unsteady. Miri, Douglas, I know what I did. I know what I threw away. His eyes were bright. He was holding himself together by a small margin. I need you to know that I know, she said, gently, genuinely. I believe you. He looked at her with the particular desperation of someone who has arrived at the apology too late and knows it. Come back, he said. We could. No, the word was quiet, and it was final, and it was without cruelty. What happened between us happened. I have forgiven it. I have genuinely forgiven it, and that forgiveness is real, and it is yours. But I am not going backward, Douglas. I am not that version of my life anymore. She held his gaze one steady moment. Take care of yourself, she said. I mean that. She turned away. Corbin had been watching from across the room, standing with a small group near the east windows, drink in hand, with the particular stillness of someone who is paying close attention, while appearing to do nothing at all. When she turned away from Douglas, Corbin was already moving toward her. Not quickly, not with urgency, just with the certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going. He touched her arm lightly. She turned and her face changed. Not dramatically, the way a room changes when the right person walks into it. The slight but complete shift from navigating to arriving. You were remarkable, he said quietly. Thank you, she said. I'm very glad you're here. He offered his arm. There's an orchestra setting up. I should warn you. I have no useful skills in that area. I did 8 years of ballroom, she said. He looked at her with honest amusement. Of course you did. Follow my lead. I was going to anyway, he said. They danced. She moved beautifully. The kind of grace that has been practiced until it no longer looks like practice. He was not trained, but he was steady and attentive. And he held her with the confidence of someone who might not know the steps, but is entirely certain about the person in his arms. They found their rhythm within the first 30 seconds. The room noticed in the way rooms notice when something is real. Conversation slowed. Heads turned without meaning to. At one point, he said something quiet near her ear. She laughed. The full, unmanaged laugh, the one that tips the head back. And he pulled her slightly closer when she did, and something in the room seemed to exhale. Douglas watched from the edge of the dance floor for a long time. He watched the way Corbin looked at her, with complete, undivided, deliberate attention, the way Douglas had not looked at anyone in years, and maybe never in quite that way. He watched her laugh with nothing performed about it. He watched Corbin say something and wait for her response with actual interest in what it would be. And Douglas Hale understood, with a completeness that had nothing to do with thought, exactly what he had lost. Not the land, not the trust, not the $2.4 billion sitting quietly underneath the woman he had called peripheral and decorative and comfortable. Her, just her. He left before dinner was served. He did not say goodbye to anyone. Tatum caught him at the coat check, her voice sharp and confused. "Where are you going?" "We haven't even. Go enjoy the evening," he said. He didn't look at her. Douglas. He walked out into the December night. He drove 3 blocks, pulled over and sat. The dashboard lights, the city continuing, the particular silence of a car in which a person is conducting a very honest conversation with himself. He said to no one, in a voice that was barely sound, "I did this. I used my own judgment and my own hands, and I dismantled everything that was real." The silence had nothing to offer him. He was not wrong. Meanwhile, in the parking structure of the Palmetto Club, Tatum Rourke was sitting in a rideshare she had called herself, her heels off, her phone in her lap, staring at the window as the city moved past. She had not cried. She was doing the calculation, the specific and unromantic calculation, of a woman who has just watched the architecture of an arrangement she thought she understood reveal itself to have been built on nothing. She thought about the promises. She thought about the plans. She looked out the window and did not let herself think much further than that, not tonight. The gala went on. Miriam danced twice more. She talked with civic leaders and nonprofit directors and a woman from Beaufort County who had attended one of the trust-funded rural schools 20 years ago and had driven to Charleston tonight because she had heard someone was finally putting a name to the thing that had changed her life, and she wanted to say thank you in person. Miriam held the woman's hands and did not try to say anything because there was nothing to add to it. 4 months later, Corbin took her to the pocket park he had designed in the neck area of Charleston. A small, stubborn, beautiful piece of land with benches and shade trees and a water feature that the neighborhood kids had immediately claimed as their own. They walked through it in the late afternoon light. "My best work," he said, not boasting, just saying a true thing. She looked at the children on the benches, the old men sitting in the shade his trees had made. She thought about her father's land, his patience, his particular way of building things for people who didn't know to expect them. "I think I know what you mean," she said. He stopped walking. He turned to face her. He was not holding a ring. He would bring that later, in the quiet of her front porch in the salt air. Right now, he was just looking at her with the full weight of someone who has arrived somewhere important and wants to be completely present for it. "I want to build things with you," he said. "For a long time. I want to be the person you call when the fig tree is doing something unreasonable. I want to know what you think about every project I work on. I want Tuesday evenings and bad coffee, and the version of this that's just regular and good in hours." She looked at him. The park around them was doing what good parks do, absorbing people, accommodating them, asking nothing back. "Corbin," she said. "I know it's yes," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, the same word, just to be clear. "Yes, to all of it," he exhaled. Then he smiled, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the eyes more than the mouth. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him. They stood there, in the middle of the best thing he had ever built, in the late afternoon Charleston light, in the completely ordinary and entirely sufficient miracle of knowing exactly where they were and exactly who they were standing with. She called Eli that night from the front porch. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did. "I want to tell you something," she said. She told him about Corbin. There was a pause on the other end. "Mom," he said. "Mom, does he see you?" His voice was careful and warned. "Actually see you?" She thought about the rosemary plant, the deliberate way Corbin listened, the park, the yes to all of it. "Yes," she said, "he really does." Another pause, and then she heard something that sounded like relief. "Then I want to meet him," Eli said. "Soon." Corbin drove to Charleston 3 weeks later, and he and Eli spent an afternoon walking the Battery while Miriam made lunch. And when they came back, They were deep in conversation about city planning and green infrastructure and making things that last. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them. She did not announce herself. She just stayed there for a moment with the dish towel in her hands and felt the specific, quiet happiness of watching two people you love simply getting along. It was enough. It was more than enough. They married the following September. The fig tree in the back garden had been, for reasons of its own, cooperative about the whole thing. The chairs were set in the garden, white flowers everywhere, the salt air moving through. Eli walked his mother down the path through the garden to where Corbin stood in the afternoon light. And when Corbin saw her coming, his face did something private and complete. The expression of a man who has spent his life building things for other people and has finally arrived somewhere that was built for him. Arthur Barnwell sat in the front row with a handkerchief he used without embarrassment. He had known Thomas Calloway for 38 years. He had carried this trust for 22. He watched Miriam speak her vows in the garden her mother would have loved, and he thought Thomas would have been unsurprised. He had always believed his daughter would find her way through. He just hadn't known how long she would need, and he had built a trust patient enough to wait. In the months that followed, Miriam ran Calloway Land Holdings the way her father had, without interest in credit, with deep interest in the work. New school programs in rural Georgia and North Carolina, a library wing in a county that had not had a new library in 40 years, a series of community parks. Corbin designed them all, in neighborhoods across the Low Country. Eli came to work alongside her the following spring. He had his grandfather's eye for value that wasn't immediately obvious, and his grandmother's precision with the details. Sundays they ate together at the Sullivan's Island house, Corbin cooking with great enthusiasm and inconsistent results, while Miriam quietly adjusted things on the other side of the kitchen. Eli sat at the counter and pretended not to notice any of it, which was its own kind of Sunday gift. There was a morning in early November when the fig tree was doing something architectural and arguably beautiful in the back garden, its branches moving slowly in the sea wind. Miriam stood at the kitchen window with her coffee. Corbin came up behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on her shoulder, and they stood there together, watching the morning come in over the water. She thought about her father in his quiet house in Somerville, building something enormous in the background of an ordinary life. She thought about her mother at the sewing table with her patient hands. She thought about the drawer, the letter, the morning she had finally opened it. It had not been an ending. It had been a clearing, the way land looks after a careful burn, stripped back, dark, ready for everything that was always going to grow there. He knew, she said softly. Corbin moved his cheek against her hair. Who knew? Should the fig tree lift and settle in the wind? My father, he knew I'd be all right. He just built something patient enough to wait until I knew it too. Corbin pressed a long, slow kiss to the side of her head. Outside, the fig tree moved in its own direction, the way it always had, stubborn and unhurried and entirely correct about where it was going. Some things know. They simply take the long way to prove it. Some women are handed a life and told to be grateful for the size of it. Miriam Calloway was one of those women. And then the morning came when she opened a drawer, read a letter, and understood that the size of her life had never been the problem. She had just been looking at the wrong measurements. She became a great deal more than comfortable. She became finally exactly what she had always been. Her father's daughter, her mother's hands, and her own remarkable self. The rest was just the world catching up. If this story found you today, perhaps it was meant to. Share it with someone who is holding on. Someone who has given the best of themselves to the wrong person and is sitting alone tonight, wondering if anything good is still coming for them. Tell them it is. Tell them it was already on its way. It just needed them to open the drawer. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hit that like button, subscribe to Rich Truths Live, and stay close because there are more stories coming. Stories about people who were quietly extraordinary all along and just needed the world to stop looking the other way. You won't want to miss a single one.